Hello, I'm Lloyd Robertson, president of the New Enlightenment Project. The critical challenge of our times is the fragmented and polarized discourse that threatens the better world our civilization has built based on Enlightenment principles. The New Enlightenment Project provides education on the enduring qualities that define humanism and applies those principles to contemporary challenges. In this offering, Canadian-born cognitive psychologist, linguist, and author Steven Pinker is interviewed by NEP board member and director of advocacy Scott Jacobsen. Dr. Pinker reflects on the repression of student speech on university campuses and the nationwide effects of cancel culture and wokism on the workplace. I know you will enjoy listening to their insights.
We're here again with Professor Steven Pinker, probably one among the most prominent humanists around, particularly around the exhaustive research you do on a variety of topics, sort of dispelling myths, around the fact that violence is declining, and things of this nature. Some of the recent news that has popped up has been around how students feel on campus about, they actually want to be able to speak more freely. I believe this is probably more particularly prominent in the American context with the First Amendment there. So what are your reflections looking over the last, I would assume something like the last decade, on campuses where there's been sort of a pushback to, let's say, bolder speech around issues that might be either new controversies or even just perennial controversies?
Well, the pushback is very recent, and there's a very strong feeling among American university students that you got to watch what you say, that you can't speak your mind. You never know whether you might commit a racism, that you might commit some kind of political sin and be canceled, what used to be called excommunicated. And I think the universities have not done a good job at at fostering a environment of free speech. There are often student orientations in which they are warned about all the ways in which they can commit a microaggression if they ask someone, where are you from? That can be considered a form of subtle racism. If you say, oh, you speak very well, that can be a form of racism. And so they often terrified. And I'm not even talking about controversial political or scientific opinions. I'm talking about ordinary interaction where they feel like they have to walk on eggshells, leading to the paradox that a lot of American university students, in their dorms, they're kind of in, adolescent heaven. They're surrounded by peers. There are constant invitations and opportunities for socializing and recreation. They eat with each other, but they say they're lonely. How can this be? And we have reason to believe that in adolescents and young adults, there are increased risk of anxiety and depression. Given that social interaction is one of the most important elixirs for mental health, why is this possible? I suspect that the fact that that interactions are so policed, are so guarded, that social opportunities for social interaction, far from being opportunities to relax and kick back and laugh together, are just more sources of anxiety, particularly when a lot of it, more and more of it, of course, is done on social media, where not only do you have to worry about being mobbed in real time, but anything you say can be dug up decades later by offense archaeologists and used to cancel you retroactively.
And these
and that's not even, none of this is even getting to expression of opinions on political or social or scientific issues.
Right. I like that. I like that step back of touching on the social dynamics. I mean, I assume this has gone into hyperdrive with a lot of the social media technologies too.
I suspect, and we do know there are cases where a famous case or a notorious case at Harvard where a student was admitted and then the admissions office rescinded his admission when one of his social enemies uncovered a late night chat when he was 15 years old, in which he was throwing around racist terms to, kind of be transgressive and be, he and his friends were being bad boys. And Harvard withdrew the admissions offer. So you have to worry not just about what you might say in an op-ed or a paper where you're formulating your opinions, but just when you're kicking back in a chat room, it might come back years later to ruin your life. So that's obviously not going to lead to a conversation, whether it be social or intellectual.
And there will be some people who, in response, will say, "Good, they got their comeuppance for the things they have done." I'm sure you live and work in that world. What happens in those contexts?
Well, one could note that one of the side effects is the epidemic of mental health problems, together with the cases in which the general attitude of censorship and cancellation leads to entire societies adopting the wrong policies or being in the dark as to major issues, such as the effects of, say, school closures and masking during COVID, where there appears to be tremendous harm on a generation of children losing out on a year or two of education based on what turns out to be a very trivial risk of their own degree of harm, at a time in which it was considered taboo to criticize policies of masking children and school closures and widespread shutdowns, when bringing it up would lead to massive condemnation. If there was a greater commitment to free speech, to people not being punished for opinions, it may have, the realization that these policies were harmful may have come sooner.
And I mean, people will probably look at this as a largely academic phenomenon outside of, say, the social media landscape. Um, People from more ordinary backgrounds who are, working blue collar jobs, don't need necessarily higher education for their pursuits. They might be thinking, it's a humanistic thing that we should generally care about, but why should I, as a blue collar person, necessarily care about this?
Well, partly it's because a lot of blue collar people are on social media, but also what happens in academia doesn't stay in academia. And in fact, uh, about 10 or 15 years ago, people made the argument, well, who cares what kids get taught, what censorship regimes are implemented in academia? When students get into the real world, they'll find that they can't get away with this nonsense. What we know happens is that the whole generation brought the regime of cancel culture into the workplace. And so publishing houses and newspapers and nonprofits and artistic organizations are being torn apart by the regime of cancel culture and microaggressions and constant accusations of racism because they've been exported from universities, and including blue collar people being fired from their jobs because of some inadvertent offense, precisely because the culture of the universities was then taken into the workplace and government and nonprofits.
And so this is not only build a chill in academic life, it builds a chill in general culture too, eventually.
Yeah, well, it's a chill in that the culture of academia is then often uh, brought into other institutions by the graduates of universities as they take positions of power. But also when it comes to societies having to make collective decisions on the basis of an academic consensus, it can often be the wrong consensus if academia itself is churning out falsehoods because ideas cannot be criticized. I mentioned the effect of school closures and masking children, but the other examples is that even the origin of SARS-CoV-2, where it was considered to be racist to suggest that it might have leaked from the virus might have leaked from a lab in Wuhan. Now we don't know that that's true, but it's not implausible. It very well might have happened. If it is true, it would have a major implication that we've got to drastically ramp up lab security, perhaps not do gain of function studies of the kind that could have created this virus, on pain of suffering from another catastrophic pandemic if we don't learn the lesson. So that's a case where what academics decide can affect the fate of the world. Another example would be effect of policing. If there's reason to think that after the George Floyd um, demonstrations and riots of 2020, that the idea that police don't matter or that there is an epidemic of shooting by racist cops may have led to withdrawals of policing that then caused the violent crime rate to spike, leading to thousands of homicides that might have been prevented if that understanding of an epidemic of racist shootings had been put into context in the first place.
And
Namely, that there just aren't really that many shootings of unarmed African Americans by cops. That this was a kind of false conclusion. Not and journalism has as much role in this as academia, but journalism too has developed a regime of cancel culture where heterodox opinions are often firing offenses. If the nationwide consensus is just distorted, then the society as a whole will adopt policies that make it worse off. Fine, I'll mention one other thing, and then I'll turn it back to you, is that even when the academic consensus is almost certainly correct, as in the case of, say, human-induced climate change, if scientists, if government officials, if scientific societies have forfeited their credibility by ostentatiously punishing dissenters, leading to the impression that it's just they're their own cult. We can blow off their recommendation because if anyone disagreed, they'd be canceled. And so it's just another cult, it's just another priesthood, it's just another political faction. And so the scientific consensus loses credibility if it comes out of a culture that is known for intolerance of dissent.
you could probably iterate that across domains, whether it's, the combat over creationism or anti-vaccine or vaccines causing autism and things of this nature.
Yeah, so if the consensus, if scientific consensus tries to debunk it, then no one has enough scientific competence to perfectly review everything that scientists say. Some of the acceptance of the findings of science has to come out of trust. Like, well, these are people who know what they're doing. They have means of distinguishing true from false hypotheses. If something they believed was false, it would be self-correcting. If you undercut that assumption, then people will just blow off what scientists say. And scientists themselves are surprisingly oblivious to this possibility. Many scientific societies just churn out kind of woke boilerplate, branding themselves as being on the hard political left and cultural left, with no appreciation that this may alienate the people who are either not on the left or on the center, who just don't care, but who perceive science as just another faction.
What areas are incursions of sort of, let's call it something like woke ideology or wokeness, into academic and empirical findings, or before the empirical findings are even in, impacting a lot of academic professional life. So at the highest level where people are, they are tenured professors, and it's ideological strain, pushing against proper consideration of the evidence.
Oh, so I'm sorry, just to pinpoint the question, what was I missed there's a little bit of a dropout at the beginning of the question.
Sure. So I believe it was around at the higher ends of the professional life in academia, around tenure professors. Uh, to what areas are the worst in terms of the incursion of like woke ideology, wokeness, however you want to frame it. Obviously, there's a phenomenon going on there, and people differ in their definitions. But so
Well, the worst are the it's worse in the humanities than the social sciences, worse in the social sciences than science and engineering, although those are generalizations. Probably worst of all in the branches of humanities and social science that are sometimes denigrated as grievance studies. But these are often departments of women and gender studies, of studies devoted to particular ethnic groups. Some of the social sciences are worse than others. I think that cultural anthropology is kind of a lost cause. There's been such ideological capture. Most of my field, psychology, is not nearly that bad, although there are strains there. In sociology is divided. There is a branch of more quantitative sociology, kind of verging into economics, that's pretty empirically oriented. But then there's another part that is far more ideological. So these are, and even the hard sciences have, and particularly the scientific societies, have plenty of wokeness, even though they themselves, perhaps the actual lab scientists are more neutral or empirically oriented, but the societies themselves tend to be woker than their members.
and why are the societies more likely to be captured than individuals?
Yeah, it's a good question. Partly because of selection, who goes into societies, into institutions. That is, if your heart and soul wants to do science, you're going to be in the lab. You're going to get your hands dirty with data. If your motivation is more political, verbal, ideological, then you'll try to become the editor of a magazine or the spokesperson for a society. There is a there is a tendency for institutions to drift leftward. Robert Conquest, the historian, sometimes credited with a law that any institution that is not constitutionally right-wing becomes left-wing. And you can see the drift. And in recent years, that's happened to many institutions that have become not just left-wing in the economic, quasi-Marxist sense, but woke in the sense of identitarian politics, seeing culture and history as a zero-sum struggle among racial and sexual groups. And a number of societies that had well-defined intellectual goals have been captured by a kind of intolerant identitarian politics. It's happened to the ACLU, it's happened to the American Humanist Association, happened to Planned Parenthood, and so I think selection is part of it. Another part may be that if we think that the way to change the world is through imposition of verbally articulated philosophies, as opposed to a kind of bottom-up experimentation, data gathering, entrepreneurship, trying things out and seeing what happens, kind of a more bottom-up approach. The top-down approach is much more likely to start with a position of a narrative and to try to impose that narrative. So there may be something more congenial in institutions to a more left-wing mindset. Just to elaborate on that a little bit, this comes from Thomas Sowell. There's some systems that achieve order kind of spontaneously and in a distributed fashion. Market economies being the most obvious, the invisible hand. There's no planner who decides how many shoes of size 8 to make or where they should be sold. The millions of people making choices proliferate information in markets, and the system as a whole becomes intelligent with no one actually articulating exactly why. The evolution of a language works that way. A culture with its norms and mores works that way. There is a kind of sympathy for these distributed systems that are more on the right, and historically, there are a lot of exceptions, but on the left, there's more of a articulation of foundational principles, a good theory, therefore, you're more likely to try to change things by joining an institution that can pass resolutions, that can implement verbally articulated policies. If you're then conversely on the right, people will go into business, people will try to invent things and hope that the invention will take off as part of this more distributed bottom-up approach.
Do you think that the general humanistic approach is basically something akin to an evidence-based moral philosophy, where you're working bottom up and then formulating the principles of your ethics from that, rather than sort of top down, as you might find in divine command theory?
I think there is some affinity that the humanism really starts from the flourishing, the suffering of individuals, and when that is your ultimate good, as opposed to implementing scriptures or carrying out some grand historical dialectic or privileging some salient uh, uh, polity or entity like a nation or a tribe, then if you're a humanist, you really have a country. The point of a religion, the point of a society, the point of an organization is whatever makes those people better off.
Let's be mindful of time. We have 1 minute. Any final thoughts based on the conversation today?
Been my pleasure. Nice to talk to you, Scott.
Excellent. Take care. Bye.
Okay, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with Steven Pinker. I know I have. The New Enlightenment Project is committed to increasing civil discussion of difficult and controversial topics. We offer a series of podcasts to further that aim. You can visit our website at nep-humanism.ca, where you can browse our blog, watch more interviews in this series, become a member, or make a donation. We are also on Facebook. You can subscribe to our podcasts and webinars at YouTube at nep-humanism. Have a good day.